Hi, welcome to the Silent Avenger channel. If you're enjoying the content, please consider giving it a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let's dive into today's story. My name's Mason, 37, and up until a few months ago, I thought I had it all. A loving wife, Camila, who I adored, a job I was proud of, and a family that I thought would always have my back. But now, I'm left questioning everything. Camila and I had been married for 9 years. We met when I was working a construction job in our small town. She was this fiery, intelligent woman who worked at a local real estate agency. I fell for her the moment she walked into my favorite diner, asking the waitress about houses for sale. She wasn't just beautiful, she had a way of lighting up a room. We built what I thought was a solid life together. Fast forward to this year, and I thought everything was fine. Sure, we had our ups and downs like any couple, but I never imagined she'd betray me. Not with my own brother, James. James is 6 years younger than me, the golden boy of our family. He's charming, outgoing, and always had our parents wrapped around his finger. I guess I should have known better, considering our history. Growing up, I was the quiet, responsible one, while James could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. When he screwed up, they called it a phase. When I made mistakes, I got lectures about responsibility. Anyway, about 3 months ago, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. Camila began working late more often. She'd spend hours texting, claiming it was work-related. I'm not proud of this, but one night when she left her phone on the kitchen counter, I glanced at her messages. That's when I saw James's name. My stomach sank. The texts were vague but way too frequent for my comfort. She deleted most of the conversations, but the tone of what remained screamed secrecy. I didn't confront her immediately. I needed more proof. Over the next few weeks, I became hyper-aware of their interactions. At family gatherings, James always seemed to hover around her. The way they exchanged glances made me sick. I started piecing together their lies, like when she said she was at a meeting but James's car was conveniently parked outside a hotel near her office. When I finally confronted her, she denied it at first. But as I laid out the evidence, her facade crumbled. She admitted they'd been talking for months and that James was supporting her emotionally. Supporting her? Really? I'll never forget how she tried to justify it. She said I'd been too busy with work, too distracted, and that James understood her in a way I didn't. It felt like a punch to the gut. I wish that was the worst of it, but it wasn't. Turns out, my parents thought Camila and James's professional meetings were harmless. They'd even babysat for us so she could attend these so-called meetings. When I tried to tell them the truth, they dismissed me, saying I was being paranoid. Little did they know Camila and James weren't just sneaking around, they had plans. Big ones. I found out they'd opened a joint bank account and were making arrangements to move to London. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to sit back and let them walk all over me. After that confrontation with Camila, everything felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. I kept replaying her excuses in my head. She painted herself as the victim, someone who needed more from me emotionally, while I was working myself to the bone to give her everything. I took a few days to process things, staying with a buddy from work while she stayed at the house. I'd walk around aimlessly, trying to make sense of it all. But there was one thing I knew, I wasn't going to let them win. Not her, not James. First, I needed more evidence. Something concrete that even my parents couldn't brush off. I went back home and told Camila we needed to talk. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her hair, avoiding eye contact. I suggested we see a counselor, and to my surprise, she agreed. At the time, I wasn't serious about therapy. I just wanted to see if she'd trip up and reveal more about her plans. The counselor asked us to keep journals of our daily activities and feelings. Camila hesitated, but eventually agreed. I knew this was my chance to gather proof. I set up a hidden camera in the living room and started going through her things when she wasn't around. I felt guilty stooping to that level, but I reminded myself that this wasn't just about me. She was planning to uproot our son's life too. What I found made my blood boil. Emails between her and James discussing how to access joint funds, fake business travel itineraries, and even conversations about schools in London. They were building a life together, and I was just the obstacle in their way. But the worst part? They had used my money to fund their little adventure. My savings, money I'd been putting aside for our son's future, was gone. I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I had everything lined up. Instead, I played the part of the clueless, repentant husband, going to counseling sessions, nodding along to her claims that we needed time to heal. Meanwhile, I met with a lawyer and a financial advisor to figure out how to protect what little I had left. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about justice. One evening, while Camila was working late again, I invited my parents over for dinner. I told them everything, about the affair, the stolen money, the fake business trips. My mom looked shocked, but my dad just shook his head, muttering about how I'd always been too sensitive. They didn't believe me. James told us he's mentoring her for her career, my mom said. You're making this out to be something it's not. That's when I showed them the emails. My dad's face turned red, and my mom just stared at the screen in disbelief. Still, they tried to downplay it. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding, my mom suggested weakly. You shouldn't rush to conclusions, Mason. I realized then that I couldn't rely on them for support. If anything, they were part of the problem, always excusing James's behavior. So, I stopped talking and started acting. After that disastrous dinner with my parents, I knew I was on my own. They'd always seen James as the golden boy, and nothing was going to change that. If I wanted justice, I'd have to handle this myself. The first step was securing my finances. I met with my financial advisor the next day and froze all joint accounts. Camila and I had shared finances for years, but I wasn't about to let her and James siphon off another cent. I also locked down my personal accounts and put a block on any transactions involving my name. To make things airtight, I changed the passwords on every account, banking, credit cards, even the utilities. I left just enough in our main joint account to keep the house running and made sure I had a clear record of every transaction they'd made. While I was at it, I reached out to a private investigator. I'd never thought I'd hire one, but I needed irrefutable proof of their affair. If this blew up in court, I wanted a full arsenal of evidence to protect myself and my son. Within a week, the investigator had photos, timestamps, and even videos of Camila and James meeting at hotels and restaurants. It was sickening to see, but at the same time, it gave me the clarity I needed. Now I could act. The next step was exposing them at work. Camila and James both worked in industries where reputation mattered a lot. She was in real estate, and he was a mid-level manager at a financial firm. I'd overheard Camila bragging about how her promotion was practically guaranteed, thanks to James's coaching. I knew if I could prove their relationship, it would blow up their careers. I gathered all the evidence and wrote an anonymous email to both their HR departments. I included photos, email excerpts, and the timeline of their affair. It wasn't long before the fallout started. A week later, Camila came home fuming. "You'll never believe this," she said, slamming her bag on the counter. "Someone sent HR an anonymous complaint about me and James. They think we're having an affair." I played dumb. "That's ridiculous," I said, doing my best to sound shocked. "Why would someone do that?" She glared at me, suspicious but too flustered to accuse me outright. "I don't know, Mason. But if this costs me my job." I shrugged, trying to hide the satisfaction bubbling up inside me. James, on the other hand, wasn't as composed. My investigator tipped me off that he'd been called into HR twice in one day. His social media accounts went dark, and by the weekend, word had spread that he was on administrative leave. One night, I overheard Camila talking to James on the phone. "We need to figure this out," she whispered angrily. "They're saying we violated the code of conduct. If this gets out..." She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what she meant. If their affair went public, their careers, and their precious plans, would crumble. But I wasn't done yet. After the HR fallout, things got even more tense at home. Camila was walking on eggshells, constantly checking her phone, probably waiting for updates from James. She tried to act normal, but I could see the cracks forming. Meanwhile, I had my next move planned, making sure their dream of starting a new life in London never materialized. The private investigator had already given me a treasure trove of information. One key detail stood out. James had applied for a visa to the UK, citing relocation for work. I also found emails between him and a real estate agent in London, discussing a rental property in a posh neighborhood. Their plan was clear. They'd leave me high and dry, drain what was left of our finances, and live happily ever after in their new life overseas. Not on my watch. First, I contacted the UK real estate agent under the guise of being a potential buyer for the same property. I told her I'd heard it was no longer available because someone else had already secured it. She confirmed James had made an offer, but the lease hadn't been finalized yet. I expressed my interest and offered to pay above the asking price. A few hours later, I got an email. The property was mine. Next, I called James's workplace. I posed as an immigration officer verifying employment details for his visa application. I dropped just enough hints about recent HR complaints to raise eyebrows on their end. The next day, James's company formally withdrew their sponsorship for his work visa. Without it, his application was dead in the water. But the piece de resistance came when I canceled their travel plans. I had access to the joint credit card they'd been using for expenses. I logged in, found their flight itinerary, and canceled the tickets. The airline confirmed the refund would be processed back to the same account, my account. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Camila found out later that evening. I could hear her panicked voice from the bedroom as she talked to James. "What do you mean the flights were cancelled?" she hissed. "They were confirmed last week." I walked into the kitchen where she was pacing back and forth, trying to keep her voice low. She hung up quickly when she saw me. "Is everything okay?" I asked innocently. She plastered on a fake smile. "Yeah, just work stuff." I nodded, pretending to believe her. Inside, I felt triumphant. Their perfect little escape plan was falling apart, and they had no idea I was behind it. The following morning, Camila confronted me about the joint account being frozen. "Mason," she started, crossing her arms. "I noticed our accounts locked. What's going on?" I feigned confusion. "Oh, that? I had to freeze it temporarily. There were some suspicious charges, and I didn't want us to lose money." "Why?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't push it further. I could see the frustration in her eyes, though. She was realizing her safety net was gone. James, on the other hand, wasn't as subtle. That evening, I got a text from an unknown number. "What the hell are you doing, Mason? You're ruining everything." I didn't respond. Let him stew in his frustration. This was just the beginning. After I sabotaged their escape plan, things started to unravel quickly. Camila and James weren't as discreet as they thought, and now the consequences were hitting them hard. The day after I received that text from James, Camila came home in tears. She'd been fired. Her boss had received an anonymous tip about her unprofessional conduct, and the HR investigation had uncovered enough to terminate her employment. I watched as she dropped her purse on the floor and sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "They think I'm having an affair," she sobbed. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? I've worked there for years." I leaned against the doorway, trying to look concerned. "That's awful," I said, though I felt no sympathy. "Do you know who could have sent the tip?" She glared at me, her face streaked with tears. "No, but whoever it is just destroyed my career." James wasn't faring any better. Word had spread among his colleagues, and his leave of absence quickly turned into a full-blown suspension. His manager, a no-nonsense type, had no patience for the drama and made it clear that his position was in jeopardy. I got wind of all this through mutual family connections. My parents, still in denial, were struggling to keep up appearances. When my mom called to vent, I stayed quiet, pretending to listen while she lamented about how someone was sabotaging her precious son's life. The pressure was getting to Camila and James. They started making mistakes. One night, Camila left her laptop open, and I noticed an email from James. He was begging her to meet him in person, claiming he couldn't take the stress anymore. "We need to talk, Mila. This is falling apart. If we don't figure this out, we'll lose everything. I can't do this without you." I copied the email to my phone, knowing it could come in handy later. The next day, I called the private investigator and asked him to keep tabs on their meeting. Sure enough, they met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. The investigator captured every moment, the tense conversation, the desperate looks, the way they argued in hushed tones. It was all on tape. I didn't need to see the footage to know what they were discussing. They were trying to salvage their sinking ship, but it was too late. That evening, Camila confronted me again. "I need to know if you're behind this," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "Everything's falling apart, and it feels like someone's out to get me." I stared at her for a moment, then gave her the most convincing lie I could muster. "Camila, I have no idea what you're talking about. But maybe you should think about why this is happening. Sometimes, Actions have consequences. Her face twisted in frustration, but she didn't push further. She was cracking, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she broke completely. The tension at home became unbearable after Camila lost her job. She spent most of her days pacing the house, snapping at me over minor things or locking herself in the bedroom. I stayed calm, acting like I was focused on work and our son, but inside, I was counting the days until everything came crashing down. One evening, Camila couldn't hold it in anymore. "Enough with the passive-aggressive comments, Mason," she said as we sat at the dinner table. "If you have something to say, just say it." I looked up from my plate, keeping my voice steady. "What is it you think I need to say, Camila?" She slammed her fork down, her face red with frustration. "You're acting like you're above all of this, like none of this affects you. But you're not perfect, Mason. Maybe if you paid more attention to me, none of this would have happened." That was it, the moment she admitted it out loud. The air in the room seemed to freeze, and for a second, I couldn't believe she'd said it so bluntly. "You mean the affair?" I asked quietly, my voice dangerously calm. Her eyes widened, and she looked away, realizing she'd just let the truth slip. But there was no going back now. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, things got complicated. I wasn't happy, Mason. And James was there for me in a way you weren't." I pushed my plate aside, leaning forward. "You weren't happy? And instead of talking to me, instead of working on our marriage, you turned to my brother? You destroyed our family because you weren't happy." She started crying, but I didn't let up. "And what about our son? What about the money you and James stole? What about the lies? How does that fit into your happiness?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't want to hurt you. But you did," I said firmly. "You both did. And now you're going to face the consequences." Her sobs turned into a stunned silence as she stared at me. I could see the gears turning in her mind, trying to figure out what I meant. "I know everything, Camila," I continued. "The money. The fake trips. The London plans. I've already made sure that none of it's going to happen. Your tickets? Cancelled. The house? Blocked. Your jobs? Gone. You and James have nothing left." She stood up, her face a mix of fear and anger. You did this?" "I protected myself and our son," I said, standing as well. "You and James made your bed. Now you get to lie in it." She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stayed at the table, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. It wasn't over yet, but the confrontation had been a long time coming. The next day, Camila packed a bag and left the house without saying where she was going. I knew she was heading straight to James. That was fine. Let them deal with the mess they'd created. Camila didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. I stayed up late, sitting in the living room with a glass of whiskey, thinking about everything that had led to this point. It was strange. After the confrontation, I didn't feel anger anymore. Just a quiet determination to move forward. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was my mom. "Mason," she started, her voice shaky. "James just called us. He says you've been sabotaging his life. What's going on?" I took a deep breath. "What's going on is that your golden boy has been sleeping with my wife and stealing from me, Mom. That's what's going on." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "James wouldn't do that," she said, but her voice wavered. I cut her off. "He would, and he did. I have proof, emails, photos, bank records. Do you want me to send them to you?" "No," she said quickly, almost panicked. That's not necessary." I could hear her trying to process it, the cracks in her unwavering belief in James finally starting to show. "You've always made excuses for him," I said, my voice firm but calm. "But this time, there's no excuse. He betrayed me, Mom. He betrayed our family. And if you keep defending him, you're betraying me too." She didn't respond, and I ended the call. Later that day, Camila finally showed up at the house. Her face was pale, her eyes puffy from crying. "I just came to get a few more things," she said quietly, avoiding my gaze. "Take whatever you need," I said, standing in the doorway as she moved around the house. As she packed, she tried to explain herself. "James and I. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I don't even know what I was thinking. I didn't mean to hurt you." I didn't respond. What was there to say? When she was done, she stood by the door, her bag in hand. "I'll be staying with James for now," she said, as if I didn't already know. I nodded. "Good luck with that." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might say something else. But she just turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the quiet house. That evening, I got another call, this time from James. "Mason," he started, his tone somewhere between pleading and accusatory. "We need to talk." "I have nothing to say to you," I replied coldly. He sighed. "Look, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But this isn't fair. You've ruined my career. Camila's, too. You've taken everything from us." "No," I said firmly. "You ruined your own career, James. You took everything from yourself. I just made sure you didn't take anything more from me." There was a long pause. Then quietly he said, "You're never going to forgive me, are you?" "Not in this lifetime," I replied, ending the call. After James's call, I realized I needed to tie up any loose ends. I couldn't risk him or Camila pulling some last-minute stunt to claw their way out of the hole they dug. First, I reached out to my lawyer to finalize the divorce paperwork. Camila had no idea yet, but I wasn't going to let this drag out. I wanted her out of my life as quickly as possible. My lawyer was thorough, ensuring that the financial records we'd collected painted a clear picture of her betrayal. Every penny she and James had taken from me would be accounted for, and every legal measure would be used to protect my son's future. Next, I focused on securing custody of my son. While Camila was preoccupied with James and trying to salvage what was left of her life, I documented everything. Her extended absences, her poor behavior during our confrontation, and her inability to prioritize our family, all of it went into the file I was building for court. At the same time, I called my private investigator and asked him to keep monitoring James and Camila. I wasn't being vindictive, I just needed to make sure they didn't try to retaliate. As the days passed, I started hearing whispers through the family grapevine. My parents, who had always defended James, were starting to crack under the pressure. Apparently, they'd confronted him about the affair, and his response had been less than apologetic. "He said Mason never appreciated you guys," my mom told me in a strained voice during one of her calls. "That he felt like you always overshadowed him, even though you had it easier growing up." I laughed bitterly. Easier? Are we rewriting history now? Because if I remember correctly, you and Dad always bent over backward for him while I was left to figure things out on my own. She didn't respond, and for the first time, I realized how deep their denial ran. Meanwhile, James and Camila were clearly struggling. The private investigator sent me a photo of them sitting together at a rundown diner on the edge of town. The once confident expressions they both wore were gone, replaced with tension and exhaustion. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. They'd gambled everything and lost. That same evening, I got an unexpected call from Camila's best friend, Sophia. "Mason," she said, her voice hesitant, "I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear from me, but I thought you should know, Camila's been telling people you're the one who ruined her life." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Of course she is. Did she happen to mention the part where she had an affair with my brother?" Sophia hesitated. "She did, but she's spinning it as if you drove her to it. That you were cold and distant, and James was just there for her." I let out a dry laugh. "Right. Because I'm the bad guy for working to provide for our family while she was sneaking around." "I just thought you should know," Sophia said quietly. "And for what it's worth, I think you're handling this better than most people would." "Thanks," I said, though her words did little to ease the frustration building inside me. The next day, I filed the divorce papers. Camila would be served within the week, and I made sure my lawyer included a clause prohibiting her from accessing any remaining shared assets. It was time to officially end this chapter of my life. A week after filing the divorce papers, Camila was officially served. I expected her to lose it, but what I didn't expect was how quickly she'd try to retaliate. She showed up at the house that same evening, pounding on the door like she was trying to break it down. When I opened it, she stormed in, holding the divorce papers in one hand and glaring at me like I was the villain in her story. "What is this, Mason?" she demanded, waving the papers in my face. "It's exactly what it looks like," I replied calmly. "Our marriage is over, Camila. You made sure of that." Her face twisted in anger. "You're just going to give up? You're not even going to try to fix this?" "Fix what?" I snapped, my voice rising for the first time. "You had an affair with my brother. You lied to me. You stole from me. What exactly do you think there is to fix? She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. Did you think I'd just roll over and let you and James destroy my life? Did you think there wouldn't be consequences for what you've done? Her expression shifted, the anger replaced by something that looked like fear. You've ruined everything, Mason. I've lost my job, my reputation. Everything. You didn't have to take it this far. I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. I didn't take it this far. You did. You and James. And now you get to live with the choices you made. She stood there for a moment, staring at me like she didn't even recognize me. Then she turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her. The next day, my lawyer called with an update. Camila had officially responded to the divorce filing, and she was fighting for custody of our son. She's claiming you've been emotionally abusive, my lawyer said. She's painting herself as the victim here, saying you've been distant and controlling. I felt my stomach drop. She's lying, I said through gritted teeth. I know, my lawyer replied. That's why we're going to fight this. We've already got documentation of her affair, the financial records, and the evidence of her neglecting your son. Stay calm, Mason. We're on solid ground. But staying calm was easier said than done. That evening, I sat down with my son, trying to shield him from the chaos swirling around us. He was too young to fully understand what was happening, but he could sense the tension. Are you okay, buddy? I asked as we played with his toy cars on the living room floor. He nodded, but his little face was serious. Is Mommy mad at you? I hesitated, trying to find the right words. Mommy and I are just figuring some things out, I said carefully. But no matter what, we both love you very much. He seemed to accept that, and I forced myself to smile, even as my heart ached. The next day, I got a call from Sophia again. Mason, she said, her voice urgent. Camila's been talking to James about getting a lawyer. She's planning to come after you hard. I thought you should know. Thanks for the heads up, I said, though it wasn't exactly news. And Mason, she added hesitantly, there's something else. James. He's been telling people you're out to destroy him. That this is all some vendetta because you've always been jealous of him. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course, he's saying that. He's always been good at playing the victim. Just be careful, Sophia warned. They're desperate. Who knows what they'll try next? I hung up, steeling myself for the fight ahead. Camila and James could spin their stories all they wanted, but I wasn't backing down. They'd started this war, but I was going to finish it. As the custody battle heated up, things got ugly fast. Camila and her lawyer wasted no time painting me as a cold, distant father who neglected her emotional needs, forcing her to find comfort elsewhere. Their narrative was insulting, but I refused to let it shake me. My lawyer was a bulldog, and we had mountains of evidence to counter her lies. I handed over everything, the emails, the financial records, the private investigators' reports. I even included the times Camila left our son with babysitters to meet James. The first court hearing was tense. Camila sat on one side, clutching a tissue and wearing the perfect mask of a wronged woman. James didn't show up, but his presence lingered in the form of the damning evidence we'd compiled. Her lawyer tried to paint me as emotionally unavailable, someone who chose work over family. When Camila took the stand, she broke into tears, claiming she'd felt ignored and unloved for years. It was almost laughable. Almost. When it was my turn, I stayed calm and stuck to the facts. I talked about the hours I worked to provide for our family, the nights I spent reading bedtime stories to our son, the sacrifices I made to ensure Camila had every opportunity to thrive. Then my lawyer presented the evidence of her affair with James. The emails, the hotel records, and the financial transactions laid it all bare. When the judge asked Camila about it, her facade cracked. She tried to minimize it, calling it a mistake and claiming it meant nothing. But the evidence was undeniable, and her excuses fell flat. By the end of the hearing, it was clear the judge wasn't buying her story. That night, I got another text from James. You're a real piece of work, Mason. You think you've won, but this isn't over. I didn't bother responding. Let him stew in his bitterness. A few days later, Camila showed up at the house unannounced. She looked different, tired, defeated. For a moment, I thought she might be there to apologize, but I quickly realized that wasn't the case. Mason, she started, her voice softer than I'd expected. Can we talk? I crossed my arms, staying by the door. What is there to talk about? She sighed, her shoulders slumping. I want to settle this. I don't want to keep fighting. I raised an eyebrow. You mean you don't want to lose? Her face flushed. This isn't just about us. It's about our son. He doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. For a moment, I considered her words. She wasn't wrong. Our son deserved better than this mess. But I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. If you're serious about putting him first, I said, then agree to my terms. Shared custody, no financial claims, and you stay out of my personal life. Her eyes narrowed. And what about James? What about him? I shot back. He's not part of this family. He's your problem now. She stared at me, her lips trembling as if she wanted to argue. But instead, she nodded and turned to leave. As she walked away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The battle wasn't over yet, but the tides were turning. After Camila's unexpected visit, things seemed to quiet down, on the surface at least. I knew better than to trust her sudden willingness to settle. It felt more like a strategic retreat than genuine remorse. The legal process dragged on, but the momentum was in my favor. Camila's affair with James had shattered her credibility, and her attempts to paint me as a negligent father were falling apart under scrutiny. Still, I couldn't let my guard down. James, on the other hand, was spiraling. Through mutual family contacts, I learned he'd been staying at a motel after Camila moved in with him, using what little money he had left. His suspension at work had turned into a full termination, and with no job prospects and a tanked reputation, he was floundering. Good, I thought. Let him feel what it's like to lose everything. Then, something unexpected happened. One evening, I got a call from my dad. Mason, he said, his voice unusually hesitant. Can we talk? I sighed, bracing myself for another round of excuses for James's behavior. What is it, Dad? It's about your brother, he said. He's not doing well. He called me last night, saying he doesn't know how to fix things. He sounded desperate. I stayed silent, letting the words hang in the air. I'm not asking you to forgive him, Dad continued. But he's still your brother, Mason. Maybe you could talk to him, help him get back on his feet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Help him? Are you serious? After everything he's done to me. I know it's a lot to ask, Dad said, his tone apologetic. But he's family. That didn't seem to matter when he was sleeping with my wife, I snapped. He made his choices, Dad. Now he gets to live with them. The call ended on a tense note, and for the first time, I felt a sense of finality in my relationship with my parents. They couldn't, or wouldn't, see James for who he truly was. A few days later, Camila's lawyer reached out with a settlement offer, shared custody with limited visitation rights for her, no alimony or financial claims, and an agreement to drop any further legal disputes. It was more than I expected, and my lawyer advised me to accept. This is as good as it's going to get, he said. I took the weekend to think it over. On one hand, it felt like letting Camila off too easy. On the other, it would mean putting this nightmare behind me and focusing on my son's future. In the end, I signed the papers. The relief was immediate. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Camila moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Our son adjusted surprisingly well, though he still asked questions about why we couldn't all live together. I kept my answers simple and honest, focusing on the fact that both his parents loved him and wanted the best for him. As for James, I heard through the grapevine that he'd moved to another state, trying to start over. I didn't care where he went, as long as he stayed far away from me and my family. One evening, as I was tucking my son into bed, he looked up at me and said, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" I smiled, brushing his hair back. "We're going to be more than okay, buddy. I promise." For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could keep that promise. Once the legal battles were behind me, I turned my focus to rebuilding the life I'd thought was lost. It wasn't easy. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a memory of Camila, and the betrayal still stung. But I was determined not to let her or James take anything more from me. The first step was moving out of the house. It had been my dream home once, but now it was just a reminder of what had gone wrong. I found a smaller place in a nearby city, somewhere fresh where my son and I could start over. Packing up our belongings was bittersweet, but leaving felt like shedding old skin. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into it, taking on new projects and even traveling for a few weeks to meet clients. The distraction was welcome, and before long, an idea began to form. I'd always dreamed of running my own business, but I'd put it on the back burner for years, focusing instead on stability for my family. Now, with a clean slate, I decided it was time to take the leap. I started small, offering consulting services in my field. The connections I'd built over the years paid off, and within months, my business began to take off. The sense of accomplishment was exhilarating, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was doing something purely for myself. At home, my son and I found a new rhythm. We'd spend weekends exploring the parks and museums in our new city or trying out new recipes in the kitchen. He loved being my assistant during my work-from-home days, sitting beside me with his crayons while I answered emails. One night, as we were watching a movie, he leaned against me and said, "I like our new house, Daddy. It's cozy." Hearing that made all the stress and heartache feel worth it. Camila tried to keep up her visitation schedule, but I could tell she was struggling. She looked thinner every time I saw her, and the confident woman I'd once known was nowhere to be found. She never said much when she came to pick up our son, just polite pleasantries before driving off. James, meanwhile, had disappeared entirely. I didn't hear from him, and neither did our parents. It was as if he'd vanished, and I was perfectly fine with that. One day, out of the blue, my mom called. "Mason," she began hesitantly, "your father and I have been talking, and we wanted to apologize." I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "We should have believed you from the start. About James. About everything. We didn't want to see it, and that was wrong. You didn't deserve any of this." Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. We hope you can forgive us," she finished softly. It wasn't the grand gesture I'd fantasized about, but it was something. "I appreciate that, Mom," I said carefully. "But forgiveness is going to take time." "I understand," she replied, and for the first time in years, her voice sounded genuine. That night, I sat on the porch of my new home, watching the sun set. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. My life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was mine again. And that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a steady rhythm. My son was thriving in his new school, making friends and bringing home drawings that filled our fridge. His laughter filled the house, and it felt like a reminder that not everything had been broken. I kept growing my business, putting in long hours but loving every minute of it. The freedom to build something of my own, to succeed on my terms, was a kind of therapy I hadn't expected. I even started meeting new people, other business owners, neighbors, and parents at my son's school. Slowly but surely, my world expanded beyond the wreckage of my marriage. One afternoon, while picking up my son from school, I met a woman named Rachel. She was waiting for her daughter and struck up a conversation about the art project our kids had worked on together. She was funny and kind, and her easy smile caught me off guard. I wasn't ready to dive into anything serious, but Rachel and I started chatting regularly at pickup times. It felt good, simple and unforced. Camila, on the other hand, seemed stuck. Her visits with our son grew less frequent, and when she did come, she looked more worn down each time. I kept things cordial for our son's sake, but it was clear she was still grappling with the fallout of her choices. One evening, after dropping our son off, she lingered at the door. "Mason," she said softly, "I just want to say I'm sorry. For everything." I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. "I hope you find a way to move forward," I said simply, and she seemed to accept that. By the end of that year, the scars of what happened felt less raw. I had my son, my business, and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The betrayal still stung when I thought about it too long, but it no longer defined me. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. By the time the first anniversary of my divorce rolled around, my life looked completely different. My son and I had settled into our new home, and my business was thriving. I'd even hired a small team to help manage the workload. For the first time in years, I felt stable, like the ground beneath me was solid again. Rachel and I had started seeing each other more often. It was nothing dramatic: coffee dates, long conversations while our kids played, and the occasional dinner. She understood my hesitation and never pushed for more than I was ready to give. Over time, her presence felt like a quiet reminder that good people still existed. Camila's visits had become sporadic. She claimed work was keeping her busy, though I knew she was struggling to hold down steady employment. James was long gone, and from what little I heard, they'd parted ways. Whatever future they had imagined together had crumbled under the weight of their own choices. She called one evening, her voice tentative. "Mason, I was wondering if we could talk. I've been thinking a lot about everything." I paused before answering. "There's nothing left to talk about, Camila. We've moved on. You should too." Her silence spoke volumes, and when she finally hung up, I felt an odd mixture of pity and relief. One weekend, Rachel invited my son and me to a park outing with her daughter. Watching the kids chase each other through the grass, their laughter filling the air, I felt a wave of gratitude. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life I was starting to love. Rachel walked over, handing me a cup of coffee. "You look like you're in deep thought," she teased. "Just thinking about how far we've come," I said, smiling. She nodded, her expression warm. "You've done a good job, Mason. You deserve this." For the first time, I believed her. Life continued to stabilize in ways I hadn't thought possible. My son was thriving. He had friends, hobbies, and a sense of security that I worked hard to maintain. My business was growing steadily, and with each passing month, I felt more confident about the future. Rachel and I grew closer, though we took things slowly. One evening, as we sat together on my porch watching the kids chase fireflies in the yard, she reached for my hand. "You've come so far, Mason," she said softly. "I hope you see that." For once, I didn't deflect or downplay it. "I do," I replied. "And I have you and my son to thank for a lot of it." She smiled, squeezing my hand. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Camila's presence in our lives had dwindled. She made occasional visits, but they were brief and strained. One day, during one of her drop-offs, she stood in the doorway, hesitating. "Mason," she said, "I know I don't deserve it, but I hope you can forgive me someday." I looked at her for a moment, searching for the right words. "I've let go of the anger," I said finally. "But forgiveness, that's something I'm still working on." She nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "I hope you find peace," she said before turning to leave. "I already have," I whispered after her, more to myself than to her. That evening, my son asked if we could bake cookies. As we worked together in the kitchen, flour dusting the counters and laughter filling the air, I realized just how much joy I'd found in the little things. The betrayal that once consumed me was now just a chapter in my story, a painful one, but not the end. I had built something stronger, something that no one could take away. As I watched my son proudly place a tray of cookies in the oven, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that was more than enough.